Well, first and foremost, I just want to thank you all for this opportunity to come and be here. Marv, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a blessing and a privilege to be back home. When I retired from basketball after 6 years of playing professionally, prematurely if you ask my mom, I don't think she was through cheering yet, but I went and spent some time with a mentor of mine in Nashville, and he asked me, what do you want to do next in this next phase of your life? And I said, I've been speaking since I was in high school. I want to travel the world and share a lot of my experiences, things that I've learned over the years. And he said something to me that I never forgot. He said, I can get you invited, but you got to get yourself invited back. And so the fact that I'm able to come home, the place where I grew up, and be able to share my life experiences and story and things that I've learned in business across the years is pretty special. So this is a tremendous opportunity to be here. A couple of housekeeping things before I get started. This is not a keynote speech. This is really meant to be more of a discussion, and so I'm going to engage you all a lot. I'm going to talk about some things that you may or may not have experience in your own life talking about in this kind of setting. Brene Brown does a tremendous job in her work talking about leaning into vulnerability. And so as I try to model that myself, I invite you to do that. But I also want you to take care of yourself. Mental health is so critical and it's so important. And so if anything is said or experienced in this space that is triggering for anyone, if you need to step outside of the room, feel free to do so. I'll stick around afterwards in the need that someone would like to debrief afterwards as well. I chose this topic, 7 steps to resetting corporate culture, because as we look around the country and see what's happening in business, there's not a need to throw out everything in the kitchen sink and start over. There's some really good things that have happened culturally that we want to carry forward, that we want to build upon. But if we're honest, there's also some areas where we've maybe not been as intentional as we could have been. And so it's in those areas that we want to reset. We're also in the midst of what I like to call a perfect storm, if you will. We're not completely out of the weeds with COVID-19. I travel all over the world and people are still wearing masks because this has hit some people harder than others. Many have lost their family members, colleagues, peers, and friends. And we've had to pivot in business in ways that we really couldn't have anticipated. At the same time, we've been thrust into more and more conversations around racial and social justice, police brutality, systemic racism, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that conversation hasn't always been met with the kind of civility that we would have hoped for. So there's a lot of fear. Folks don't want to be offended. And at the same time, I'm not sure everyone's intentions are to be offensive. But sometimes it seems like there's way more combativeness than there is real solutions. And then we saw safe at home orders going on all over the world. And I feel like sometimes we forget that everybody's not safe at home, as we saw a rise in not only domestic violence, but also child abuse. And just because we don't want to talk about it doesn't make it any less real, particularly for the people who experience it. And then lastly, mental health. As we've all been in this hustle and bustle, continuing to build, grow, and scale, putting out one fire after another, sometimes at the expense of ourselves. And we don't always prioritize doing the things that build us up, that make us feel good about ourselves like we should. I hope you realize in this perfect storm, nobody's exempt. No matter the community, no matter the business, no matter where you come from, no matter the language, we're all in the same perfect storm together. And what I would like you to kind of grapple with as we engage, we're only going to go for about 90 minutes, but I want you to be thinking about the simple fact that while everybody is in the exact same storm, that every individual is in a different boat with different access, different resources, and different support systems. And our responsibility is to make sure that as we come out of this perfect storm, that people aren't just showing up saying, hey, I survived, but that every individual has a real opportunity to thrive. And so that's a large part of what today's discussion is going to be about. So I know you didn't get this from my height when I walked in, but I definitely did play a little basketball in my day, as was mentioned in my introduction. But I want to start off talking about my childhood. I spent the first 6 years of my life living with my grandparents. How many of you spent a lot of time with grandparents growing up? Right? So you know what I mean when I say I heard a lot of stories. They were like professional storytellers. My grandfather, who's pictured here, he served in our country's military. And he had two rules in our house growing up. He said, you be respectful to adults and you be respectful to women. Anything else we can talk about and come to an understanding. But those two things were always non-negotiable. And so as a result, I've tried to embody that in my own life. My grandmother was a missionary at our church. My great uncle was the pastor of that church. My aunts and uncles were in the choir. You see where I'm going with this? I was in church every day. I did not want to be in church every single day. But they thought it was important to surround me with a village. That old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. And so I was fortunate to have this huge village around me. And then at the age of 6, my life took a drastic turn as I got introduced to a stepfather. Now, my dad's been in my life the whole time. I love my dad. He's a phenomenal man, great role model. He was the valedictorian of his high school class. He was the #2 basketball player coming out of the state of Mississippi at the time. I got the basketball genes, the valedictorian genes went to my siblings. I don't know what's up with that. That's just how it rolled out, right? So my dad is a great man, role model. Like, it's my guy. So I wasn't too excited about this whole stepdad thing. And I remember thinking at 6 years old, you know, my dad is 6'8". 5'8" just wasn't gonna cut it for a dad. We got off to a rocky start, right? And over the next 6 years, I witnessed my mother be in an abusive marriage. One that was physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive. And I saw things at a young age that kids probably shouldn't see. I learned during that time what I call the duality of people. How we can be so great in some areas of our life and yet still struggle so deeply in some others. This stepdad wasn't all bad. He was the first person to introduce me to organized sports. It would take me all over the state of Louisiana, going back and forth to practices and games. He had me to tie my right arm behind my back and forced me to dribble with my left hand. It's probably one of the single things that gave me a chance to actually be good in basketball. He said, you got 6 siblings, 2 brothers, 4 sisters. So how you show up in the world every day, it matters because you're their role model and they're gonna follow your lead. He said, you get one mom. By circumstance, you might get another dad, but man, you love and protect your mom with everything in you. The same person that added all this great value to my life was also the one who caused the most pain. As I lived the experience that where you find domestic violence, you often also find child abuse. And so I endured that as well. So while I would like to say that I just grew up watching Michael Jordan and wanting to be like Mike, like a lot of other kids, the truth is basketball was my escape. It's how I got away from all the yelling, the screaming, and the trauma. And I was fortunate enough. I played well and earned scholarships, could have gone to any school in the entire country. I chose Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, partly because it was 8.5 hours away from here. And I wanted to make sure my family had to call first before they just popped up. But also, the first person I met on my visit there was a guy by the name of David Williams. David was the athletic director at Vanderbilt. He was the first African-American athletic director in the Southeastern Conference. And I'll never forget, he and my grandmother on a visit talking about Kokomo, Mississippi and Blue Springs. Places that are so small you probably couldn't point it out on a map, but it just so happens both sides of my family call this place home. So it made me feel at home for him to be there. The second person I met was a woman by the name of Dr. Candace Story Lee. She was in academic support at the time, but now she's the athletic director at Vanderbilt, the first African-American female athletic director in a Power 5 conference. And so seeing them operating at such high levels of excellence and prestige, it made me feel like, you know what, maybe I too, a kid from New Orleans, could achieve at this level. And so I chose Vanderbilt, and I felt really good about that decision until I got in my first class. I'll never forget being in this huge auditorium. There's 200 students in the auditorium, and the professor asked the question, how many of you, by show of hands, were valedictorian or salutatorian of your high school class? And I look around, 198 students got their hands up. Everybody except for me and one of my teammates. We sitting there looking at each other like, it's gonna be a long 4 years. Vanderbilt was hard. And one of the ways I learned how to compete in the classroom the same way that I did on the basketball floor was by getting to know those other classmates. People from all over the world, different backgrounds, different upbringings, different languages. And oftentimes, I'd go back to their hometowns when I got a break and hang out with them and their families and learn their cultures, their traditions. And it was so important because I learned, just like Maya Angelou always said, that we are so much more alike then we are unalike. I would also share some experiences with them that they didn't have. Like how often I would drive from one side of campus to the other, especially at nighttime, and I'd get pulled over by a police officer. And every time I sit there at 10 and 2, just like I was taught. I'd already have my license and registration out to hand to them. They'd approach the car, I'd let down the window, and every single time the officer said the exact same thing. I'm sorry, Mr. Foster, I didn't know it was you. Have a good day. That's what my life was like. Being a star basketball player in Nashville, Tennessee, Nash Vegas as they like to call it now. I had my face on billboards all over the city. It was on the cover of newspapers, magazines, you name it. And I did so much philanthropically in the community, they knew I was a good kid, at least I was trying to be. So they let me go. What they didn't know is that as they walked back to their cars, I'd have to sit there and gather myself for a moment. Sometimes wiping a tear from my eyes, as I remember the promise I made to my mom when I was 13. You see, at 13 years old, I was walking down the street dribbling a basketball like I often would right here in New Orleans. An officer came and he grabbed me and he threw me up against a neighbor's home. And he's yelling and screaming and patting me down. I'm scared and nervous, not knowing what's getting ready to happen. And I look around me and I see all of my neighbors and friends and peers. Everybody standing on their lawns watching, but nobody's doing anything about it. As the officer let me go, I asked, why did you do this? I wasn't doing anything wrong. And he said, we got a call about some suspicious activity in this neighborhood. And he said, you fit the description. I was 13 years old. I didn't know what he was talking about. So I asked, what description do I fit? I get home, I asked my mom, what description do I fit? She said, son, I hope this wouldn't be your experience. There's been so much progress. But the truth is, the same thing happened to your grandfather. The same thing happened to your father. The same thing happened to your cousin, and he lost his life. And this probably won't be the last time that it happens to you, because the description you fit is a black man in America. And she said, son, I want you to promise me something. Promise me that you will always make the decisions that bring you back home. Sometimes keeping that promise has been easier than others. I went on to become Vanderbilt University's all-time leading scorer in our school's history, accomplished a lot in basketball, and the picture that you see here with my grandparents is from February of last year when Vanderbilt decided to retire my jersey. I got inducted into 2 Hall of Fames, which makes me sound so old. Like I'm really not, but I have had amazing experiences. I will say that it's weird going into the gym now in Nashville and seeing my jersey hanging next to 2 dead people. That's weird, right? But I've had amazing experiences. You know, what I remember most about all of the exposure, all of the travels, all of the experiences, people welcoming me in their communities, their homes, teaching me their traditions. What I remember most are the people. And the reason I remember those people is because it allowed me to solidify values in my life. Values that shape not just how I show up in the world or how I do business, but most importantly, values that shape how I treat people. And so that's where we're going to start with our discussion today, talking about values. You see, what I've learned is that our values are the very foundation of what we call the workplace experience. It's what we use to hold people around us accountable. It's what we use to hold ourselves to high standards. It's all about values. My grandmother used to say it this way. She said, faith is not faith until it's been tested. And the same is true about our values. It's easy to put values on a website. It's easy to use them in our hiring. It's easy to run around and say that we treat everybody like family. But it's in the moment when there's a decision that needs to be made, and it's not the most popular. It's when those things are going to ruffle feathers, that it's going to disrupt the status quo. It's in those moments that we make a conscious decision. Are our values real? Or is it just talk? And so I'm going to give you 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. And I want you to turn and talk to the person either to your left or your right. And I want you to share with them the value that matters the most to you. The value that shows up when you show up. Not the company value, not what you've heard Marv talk about, but how you show up. But I want to put a little spin on it. If the lowest earning person in this business was to come up here and speak on your behalf, what would they say you value? Not because of what comes out of our mouth, but because of what they experience when they experience you. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Go. All right, let's bring it back. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Thank you so much. I need two volunteers. We got 3 sections. Let's go 2 volunteers from each section. What's the value that you shared? What's important to you? What shows up when you show up? Somebody from this side, anybody. Please, go ahead.
Integrity.
Okay, why integrity?
So I was talking to Devon here, and there was a clip I saw about SEAL Team 6, and the guy was like, how do you choose who goes on SEAL Team 6? And it drew a simple graph, and it's performance and trust.
Yeah.
So I'll keep it short, they'll take the person over who is medium performing but high trust over the guy that is high performance, low trust, because that's a toxic leader.
No.
So even I would say like hard work is something that's important too. Integrity, I think by far trumps that, because I'll take the person that I trust with my life and my finances and everything else over the person that will outperform.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you for that. Somebody else. One other volunteer from this side. Please.
Honesty.
All right. Where did you learn that as a value?
Starting for me at home.
Yeah.
Started with that, and then just experience, build within myself that honesty was important. From honesty comes trust. From trust comes integrity.
Yeah.
Core for me was honesty.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. Thank you for that. 2 from this side, please.
Genuine.
Yeah, let's stand up. Let's try to be loud so everyone can hear.
By the way, Shane, that's the worst looking GM we have.
That's tough. Go ahead.
Genuine care for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Where'd you learn that?
My mother. She's a very religious person who takes care of people before she takes care of herself, and all that that's about.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Someone else. Another volunteer from this side. Please. I'm coming over there in just a second. Let me go here, and then I'm going to come to that side. I'm coming right to you, right after this. Go ahead.
Respect.
Okay, respect. Why respect?
Because I was taught that respect will take you through the world.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. My brother over here. Come on. Come with it.
I show ambition, and I have a mission when I come to work. With all the places I go to, I hold it to a man, and I stand behind it.
Yeah.
I do your job, I do the worst, I do the best.
Yeah.
But I'm going to make you better. You don't get better, and it's not up to standard. We got to part ways, and I keep that ambition with me because I had it done to me a bunch of times because I didn't have the ambition when I was starting off.
Yeah.
Once I got it, I understand it, and I hold it to every team member that's around
Yeah. Love it. Thank you.
all the time.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Thank you. One more from this side, please.
Yes, we brought up honesty and integrity, but service.
Mm.
It's what we do. It's what we do with everything. Do what you say and say what you do.
Yeah.
And just, we're here to help people.
Yeah.
It's my faith, like yours.
Yeah.
That is, every time someone comes in there, you treat them like family. Because we all are.
Yeah.
We can't do something for everybody. And if you're not enjoying this, why are you doing that type of business or in life?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why you're here to help people.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. Let's clap it up for those who volunteered. Thank you. It's been interesting to me, no matter where I go, really in the world, because internationally it's the same. Most people share the same values, especially once we get to leadership position. Very seldom do you hear new values. And sometimes we get intolerant of people who don't share our same values, right? But the thing that has been intriguing to me is how we live in a world that has normalized contradictions. This is what I mean by that. How many of us have kids in the room, right? So this might resonate with you. We tend to tell our kids, do what's right. Stand up for what's right, even if that means you got to stand by yourself. You stand on your morals, you stand on your values. But as adults, we don't like to stand by ourselves. And we constantly make the decisions that allow us to fit in the most. There's a great documentary on Netflix called The Mask We Live In that talks about how we literally walk around wearing the mask that allows us to fit in the most. And when we do that, oftentimes we give up a piece of ourselves. We sacrifice our authenticity. I retired from the game of basketball after 6 years of playing professionally because I started realizing that I was literally having to give up a part of who I am just to fit into the NBA culture. And so I gave up the game that I dreamed about since I was 5 years old. And I started spending more time in communities and spending time with people in businesses and organizations across the world. And I learned some things that were earth-shattering to me. You see, at this point in time in my life, I was pretty arrogant. You got to be a little arrogant to play pro ball. And so I was, and I thought I had a pretty good pulse on what was happening in the world and what was happening in business around me. But then I learned some things. I learned that 1 out of every 4 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. How many of us, by show of hands, we could name 4 women in our life that we love? That's everybody. I learned that 1 out of every 5 women have been sexually assaulted. That 1 out of every 7 boys have been sexually abused, and they never talk about it. That every single day in our country, 3 women are killed by an intimate partner who simply says they love them. That more than 15 million children in our country face abuse, either in their households or in their communities. And of those 15 million children, the boys are more than twice as likely to repeat the behavior they saw. And the girls are more than twice as likely to be victims. I started asking the question, how? How can this even remotely be true when everybody seemingly shares the same values? Of treating people with dignity and respect, the importance of character and integrity, treating people like family, treating people the way that you want to be treated. And yet this has been the experiences of people. You might be asking yourself, Shane, why are we even talking about this? I thought we were supposed to be talking about workplace culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, what I found is that the same culture that allows that violence to happen is the exact same culture that produces 1 in 5 women in the workplace being sexually harassed. And the EEOC says that more than 75% of the time, when it is reported, that they're met with retaliation. How? We can pick a random 25 companies, peruse their websites, and find their values. None of their values speak to women having a 1 in 5 chance of being sexually harassed. Or even remotely talks about the idea that a person can be retaliated against just for saying, this is what happened to me. And yet this has been the experience. As I did my own research and talked to experts around the country, what I found is that there's a culture that exists that allows this to happen. One where we make excuses for the bad behavior of others. How many of us have heard the phrase, boys will be boys? Right? No matter that it carries this anti-male implication that we should just expect bad behavior from guys, but we say it all the time. It's just guy talk. It's just locker room talk. They don't mean anything by it. It's a culture. It's the same culture where we're so quick to ask victims, well, what role did you play in what happened to you? Did you wear something that was sexually suggestive? Did you leave a drink unattended? Did you share your location before you left? Did you go somewhere with your friends? Or why are you saying something now after all of this time? What's your motive? You shouldn't be so sensitive. It's a culture. It's the same culture where we don't even believe people when they share what happened to them. How many of us remember the incident where Ray Rice in the elevator with his fiance? Ray Rice was a running back for the Baltimore Ravens. He would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer, except for one day he punched his fiance in the face in the elevator. And what I remember about that time is that for an entire week, all we had was her story, her testimony, saying, this is what Ray did to me. And good, well-meaning people said, I don't believe Ray would do that. He's such a good guy. I've seen all the stuff he does in the community. Seems like he's a great dad. I just don't believe he would do that. If we're honest, the same thing that we would say about the people in our lives that we've put on a pedestal. People who have spent time with our families, people who have been with the company for X amount of years, people who have obtained certain levels of economic success. Without any inclination of what actually happens behind closed doors, we go on record and say, I don't believe they would do that. And then the video came out and we were all disgusted at what we saw. How many of us have daughters? If your daughter comes home and says something like that happened to her, are we asking for a video? Not a chance. But it's been acceptable to treat other people's daughters differently. We're going to watch a video that was created for the Army, and I find it appropriate for this conversation, and so I play it all over the country. But as you hear them talk about the Army, I want you to think about this company. I want you to think about your own experiences over the course of your career. Think about the people who will be hired in the next 2 to 3 years. What have we been exposed to? What kind of behavior has been made acceptable? And most importantly, what is the impact to workplace culture? We'll watch the video and then we'll talk about it. Let's check this out.
Hi. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the reason for all these briefings, the constant preaching, and the redundant teachings. I guess your leadership figures that if you constantly train, then eventually you'll be able to tame me. That's a large feat. I'm the SHA in your SHARP program. I'm the ulcer in the belly of your organization. I'm the degradation of your 7 core values. I'm the bane of your SARC's existence. I'm the real deal. You're just child's work. I am the strongest army on earth, and ironically, my recruits, they're forces from your armed forces. See, I force discord between brothers and sisters in arms, and forewarning, I'm swarming your ranks at alarming rates. Any day, I'm less than double arms distance away. All it takes is for us to be at close intervals and for her to be dressed right, wearing something tight or something short so it lets me know that she's open for my type of attention. See, she joined so she can be a part of something she can be proud. I'm sure parents, they thought that she would be safe amongst your ranks, but I'm the paw print crawling up your daughter or your little sister's inner thighs while she's in her sleep. I entered her room so I can enter her womb. See, alcohol normally increases my success rate. These 2 dudes, they saw me drag her, they saw me walk her in, and neither of them said a word. See, their nonchalantness is the reason I'm so accomplished. They may as well be my accomplice. Intervention is my kryptonite. I would be invincible if it wasn't for nosy battle buddies bold enough to put their noses into my business. The only person with a chance of stopping me is a bystander who's willing to uphold the standard. But long as he continues to stand down, then I'll continue to stand up and raise the stats up. And oh, by the way, let your EO rep know I'm all for equal opportunity. I don't discriminate. I operate within seniors and subordinates alike. See, I was saw as a major issue once Shassan majors were issued walking papers for taking parts in the likes of me. That's when I knew I had hit the big leagues. I love to ride the coattail of the higher ranking personnel. I'm a pro at qui pro quo. In my simplest form, I come by way of a slide comment or a compliment with a drizzle of sexual content. And I'm rampant throughout your workplace. I hide my face behind jokes and jargon like, well, that's what she said. In a second I see you smile and you fail to correct me, I'm gonna place the crosshairs across your head and I'm gonna cross you the next time that we cross paths. And contrary to popular belief, men are also a preference for me. I've been able to assault, I've been able to talk at least 1 in 6 into unwanted sex, and most aren't man enough, most are too man to admit it, so I'm able to operate in iniquity without penalty. See, an assaulted man's ego is badly bruised, but it's still too huge to seek assistance, so the heinous act just sits in his system and eats away at him like cancer. There's no chance of assisting a man who insists on keeping me inside in his little secret. Most think that I'm nocturnal. I'm not. I knock whenever opportunity suits me. I'm normally suited in a familiar face. And I've heard some say that about 8 in 10 military women have met me, but only 3 in 10 will admit it, probably because they're afraid that she'll think they're the reason why the crime is committed. Because you make comments like, well, that's what happens when you wear those rape clothes. When you walk says I'm willing to let you assault/harass me against my will. Everyone knows that permission and promiscuous is paternal twins. You can't blame him if she was out after 1 a.m. Just common knowledge that all body parts are up for grabs after midnight. She met me because she kept a grown man parked in a friend zone for too long when she knew all along all he wanted to do was break his parking brake off in her. She should have known better than to trust someone who called themselves a friend. Now let me give you some other reasons why she didn't report. She didn't report it because the last time she was the subject of something similar, she was subject to questioning like she was the prime suspect. She didn't know. She had no clue that harassment was punishable by finger pointing. She said they held enough fingers in her face to outfit 1,000,000 hands. She learned that her shorts would be called to the stand as a cotton material witness to testify against her that her legs were out after midnight. She learned that in the land of the free, harassment was punishment for having the nerve to choose your own wardrobe. She learned that she could be convicted of having an enticing figure. Now go figure. Assaulters were people just like you are. And we don't deserve to be tempted. In case you hadn't sniffed it, I'm sexual harassment and assault. And if you don't learn to control me, I'll continue to be the oasis of hate surrounding your rings. I'm the new age form of fratricide. I'm the sum of division. And you'll never be able to solve me if you don't stick together. I'm a combat minimizer. And until you learn to defeat me, you'll never be able to defeat your country's enemies. I want to thank you for your ongoing support.
First time I saw this video, that last line hit me like a ton of bricks. That I want to thank you for your ongoing support. And I remember thinking to myself, there's no way in the world that I support this. Then I had to be honest with myself. I've been in a lot of locker rooms. I've been in a lot of boardrooms. I've been on a lot of golf courses. And there's probably very few things that I've not seen or heard. And I didn't always speak up. I didn't always say something. And even in those moments when I was uncomfortable myself, I still allowed someone else to walk away from that encounter feeling like what was said or done was acceptable, and it wasn't. And so that's on me. Now that I know better, I make a conscious effort to do better. Here are some of the quotes and themes from the video that we just watched, but I want to give you an opportunity to reflect. What did you hear that mattered to you, that resonates with you based on your experiences? What have you seen? What have you heard? What are those moments when we saw something or we heard something and we just didn't have the words or didn't have the courage to speak up? Again, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Turn and talk to the person to your left or your right. And just share with them what resonated the most with you. Go. All right, let's bring it back. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Anyone would like to share? I'm not going to go by section this time, but just a few folks who want to share something that resonated with them, something that they heard from a teammate or a peer related to the video that we just watched. Anybody? Please.
We recently had a team member, one of our management team, go out on maternity leave. Before she did, there were some offhanded comments made about who's the father, this kind of stuff, and it was something that was stopped in the moment. Like that's a manager in our company. I said, you got to speak about her with respect, not in that way. And those kinds of things get laughed off every day, and that's what that individual was looking for, was the ha-ha laugh off, not the cold dead stop.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what it means to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Others, please.
I'm gonna say that's what she said. You
Yeah.
know, when the video was playing, I saw his face. I saw the guy as sexual harassment. But when he was like, "But that's what she said," then I saw so many other faces on this person, and it's eye-opening.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. Others, please.
Ego keeps people from seeking assistance. Sometimes I believe the way that people perceive other people, they don't want it to be damaged. So because of my ego and the way I'm perceived to other people, I don't want to ask for assistance in certain delicate situations because now I don't want people to tiptoe around me.
Yeah.
I don't want people to look at me differently.
Yeah.
I don't want to be perceived not strong.
Yeah.
I don't want to be perceived weak.
Yeah.
So one's ego can keep them from asking for help.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Thank you for that, brother. Go ahead.
So, the part you was talking about with people standing down,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the part about dragging someone away, just that is a very, very obvious part of his conversation.
Yeah.
It's not even something that, like one of the jokes or one of his, locker room talk things that someone could even be less experienced in this stuff that we're talking about, like your past you were talking about.
Yeah.
He's specifically talking about dragging someone off. That's not something that you really have to have a brain to stand there and see and take care of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Any others, please?
Speaking from a woman's perspective, we have to be super aware of what we wear, what we say, what we do, especially walking around the French Quarter, it's like the ogling, the comments, things like that. It's sad, but it's true. I don't know if any of you guys ever saw the thing that says if there were no men in the world for like a whole night, what would you do? I'd go for a jog at midnight. I would, just hang out outside at night by myself. Those kind of things
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any others? This is a very important conversation, and it's one that we don't have enough. And while it helps us to resonate when we think about it in relation to the women and girls in our lives, the truth of the matter is, this is not gender specific. Harassment can happen to anyone. And it happens to men not nearly as frequently as it does for women, but it happens to men as well. But most of the time, men don't say anything, because the perception is that either they're supposed to like it or they're weak if they do speak up. And so it doesn't get talked about. And as a result of us tiptoeing around these conversations and not really speaking up, particularly in the moments when we need to, it creates a culture where now this issue is the most underreported crime in the world. Think about that. The most underreported crime in the world. What that means is that there are people who we work with on a regular basis, people who we see all the time, and we assume that because they've not said that they've been sexually harassed, we assume that everything's all good. I've been doing this work for over a decade. For 7 years, I did sexual harassment and violence prevention training in companies across the country. There was never a time when I went into a company and someone didn't say, "This is a great place to work. We have an amazing culture. We treat everybody like family." And then we get in and we do the work. The first thing that happens is the person in charge usually asks me, "Hey, can we do this in 30 minutes? I'm like, "What you want me to do, introductions and walk out? What do you think we're gonna get done in 30 minutes? That communicates it's not important. But then secondly, everybody always says that this is a great place to work, this is great culture, this is family, but then they hear the experiences of people and we're always completely shocked. This is the most unreported crime in the world. My point is, we can't make the assumption that everybody is having a great experience. We got to do the work of creating the psychological safety such that in the event that something is happening, we can talk about it. We can hold people accountable. We can create the kind of culture that matches the experience that we want people to have. And what Lieutenant General David Morrison says, I think, is really relevant. The standard that we walk past is actually the standard that we accept. In other words, we don't get to be these self-proclaimed great leaders who just choose to turn a blind eye, who choose to sweep things under the rug. Every single individual, regardless of your title or tenure, every individual has a responsibility when you see something to say something. How does this same conversation that we're having around sexual harassment in the workplace also apply to race? Think about it. The language, the jokes, the sweeping of things underneath the rug, the things we don't talk about, the times when we hear things or see things happen and we don't always have the words or we don't always have the courage to speak up, the impact that it has to people who are constantly thinking about and having to be aware of not only their physical but their emotional safety. It's all the same stuff. The retaliation, when individuals share that, hey, this has been my experience. It's all the same stuff. If I had time, I could literally show a different video about every single diverse issue. Every single one. It's all the same stuff. Whether you're a person of color, whether you're someone who is identifying as gender queer, whether you're someone who has a disability, whether you're someone of an older age. You know, the studies show that 1 out of every 6 people have what's called a neurodiversity. Contrary to popular belief, diversity is not just about race and gender. Diversity is about every single thing that makes us unique. Every single thing, and it's not a bad thing. We all actually like diversity. I'll prove it to you. Think about the home that you live in. Do we have the same furniture in our bedroom as we do in the kitchen? No. Why? Because we like variance. I've been fortunate enough to visit many of the restaurants under this brand. Many of them are different. Why? Because people like variance. People like variety. People like diversity. It's only when we start talking about people that all of a sudden diversity gets hard. It's not hard. But we got to get to a place where we value diversity. It's in our differences that produce value. Even though we live in a world that's pushing and running after similarities, it's actually our differences that produce the value. Diversity is about everything that makes us unique. When it comes to how diversity is framed within a business context, it's also not just about people. The people are important, but it's also about who we choose to do business with. It's also about where we spend our philanthropic dollars. Where are we volunteering our time? The different products and services that we create to be able to serve diverse communities. It's about our messaging and who's targeted in our communications and our outreach. It's about where are we looking for talent? Where are our relationships? Diversity is about every single thing that makes us unique. When it comes to equity, there's a difference between equity and equality. Equality is everybody gets the same thing. Everybody came in, everybody's sitting in the same chair. Regardless of your height, some people knees are in their chest, some people are comfortable. That's equality. Everybody gets the same thing. Equity is making sure that every individual gets what they need. So imagine working for an organization where you have 100 people who English is not their first language, but all of the communications are in English. That's called equality. But you can see how equality would create a disadvantage for people who English is not their first language. Equity would be making sure that all of the communications are in everyone's language such that there's an even playing field. That's equity. It's not about making sure that everybody reaches the same outcomes. It's about making sure that the parameters are such that with the same effort, with the same energy, with the same work ethic, that those outcomes are possible. And then when we think about inclusion, it's about the ability to truly belong. You think about the spaces that we walk in. People call us by our name. People spell our name correctly. They take the time to make sure that in emails and text messages, they actually spell it correctly. I'm one of those people who get my name spelled wrong every day. People love putting an E on my name. There's no E on my name, but it's still pronounced Shane. It happens daily, right? But in spaces where I truly belong, they spell it right. They care. They ask me questions about stuff that ain't even my area of expertise because they value my opinion. That's inclusion. If I identified as a lesbian woman, I'd feel comfortable putting pictures of my family in the workplace like many other people do. Why? Because I actually belong here. I'm included. When it's time to make business decisions, I'm asked my opinion about what's happening on the ground and how is this impacting various communities. Because I'm included. And then there's empathy. Empathy is about the ability to seek to understand and not allowing our own experiences to drive the narrative. It's about valuing the experiences of people outside of oneself. When I started doing this work, I asked my partner, I said, tell me some things about your experience in the workplace. And she said, well, every time I leave a building at nighttime, I walk out with my keys in my hands like this. She said, when I turned 12 years old, I got a bottle of mace that I keep on my keys. She said, I got to make sure I park underneath a light at nighttime when I'm leaving certain spaces. She said, I look in the backseat of my car every day before I get into it. I said, wow, that's interesting. You in the backseat of my car, you better cancel Christmas. You ain't going to make it. That experience didn't resonate with me because that's not been my experience. But it's no less valuable just because it's not been my experience. I validate her experience. I'll give you another one. I've been living in Nashville for the last decade, and we have a pretty significant hockey team that's there in the NHL, and y'all know this. There's no hockey team in New Orleans. Like this, I didn't grow up watching hockey. I could care less about hockey. But it's important to me that the people in Nashville who like hockey have that as an option. I get to go to the basketball games and turn up and have a great time. They get to go to the hockey game and turn up and have a great time. The fact that I care about their experience just as much as I care about my own, that's called empathy. It's not about me. It's about validating the experiences of others. That's empathy. It's important to really, truly understand what these terms mean as we hear them, because this is not what you're going to hear in politics and on social media and sometimes on the news that's pushing a different kind of narrative. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not about something being forced down companies' throat and something being pushed on people. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is about people, and it's about everybody. Regardless of how we identify, regardless of where we're from, regardless of who we love, regardless of the language we speak, regardless of the traditions and cultures that we grew up in. DEI is about everybody. And it's not limited to race and gender. It's about every single thing that makes us unique. And what I've learned is that the more diverse teams actually produce better outcomes. Not solely about the diversity, but mostly because when we have diversity in a room and we empower that diversity through inclusion and equity and empathy, now we're able to see the value that is produced by that diversity. When we don't have to think about every single scenario and situation because somebody in the room is going to think about it because that was their experience, because they bring that variety to the table. I'm going to give you 7 steps to how we intentionally reset corporate culture. And the goal of resetting corporate culture is to make sure that we position ourselves and have the facilitating conditions such that every individual reaches their peak potential. And when every individual, regardless of how they identify, when every individual reaches their peak potential, now the company as a whole can reach its potential. The first step that you see here is starting with discovery. Discovery is so important, it's valuable, because it's from there that we can now fully understand what our strategic direction should be. In other words, we can't just start doing stuff. Years ago, George Floyd gets killed. We saw the most diverse protests we've ever seen in the history of this country. We saw companies starting to put out diversity statements and doing all kind of things and bringing in speakers and starting committees and doing stuff, all well-intentioned. But oftentimes we didn't start with discovery. And so when we don't start with discovery, then now we don't have any data to back up our decisions. So what happens? Companies started reading a book called White Fragility. Good book. Talks about white privilege, very good book. I do not recommend we start talking about white privilege. It's not the place to start. It pushes people away. It shuts people down. And as a result, we saw a lot of conversations get shut down. And even companies that said that they were going so hard for diversity, equity, and inclusion, you look 2 and 3 years later and you see they've done nothing. Because we didn't start with discovery. In discovery, we're looking at a couple of things. First and foremost, our policies. Just like you, every time I went to school, they gave us a student handbook, right? We all got student handbooks. How many of us read the student handbook? Right? We got like 2 people per section, right? We don't read it. And the same thing happens when we go to work. We got a policy manual, we don't often read it. So we don't know what's there. We don't know how it applies to us. We don't know how to use it. That's critical information. Because if you have not read the handbook, then when something occurs, you don't actually know how to be helpful. In discovery, we got to start with understanding what's in our policies, where are the gaps, and how do we make sure that everyone working in the company knows how these policies actually apply to them in their situation and the role that they're in. We also got to look at our hiring. Most companies do a great job of hiring based on referrals. But what I've learned is that we all live very, very segregated lives. We do, we just do. And I learned this only because I played basketball and got fans all over the world who follow me on social media. And so I see that, like, you know, I go and do some work at a company and they're like, oh, we value diversity. And then you look at their pictures online on Facebook and Instagram and you don't see no diversity. Somebody get married in their family, you look at the family photos, you don't see no diversity. Sweet 16 party for the kids, you look around, you don't see no diversity. We live segregated lives. We don't do life together. And so if we're incentivizing referrals, but we're getting referrals from people who don't do life with the diversity that exists in the community, then our hiring is only going to look as good as the diversity of our personal networks. So we got to be able to assess, how are we actually finding the talent that is here and what is that producing? We also got to understand, what does the trajectory look like? So if somebody gets hired today in an entry-level position, what is the pathway to leadership? Is there a pathway to leadership? What are the professional development opportunities that are there? What are the mentorship opportunities that are there? How do we assess whether or not that's working, regardless of how people identify, regardless of their proximity to leadership? We got to assess our job descriptions. A lot of the workforce is feeling very overwhelmed right now. People are burning out day after day after day, so we got to be able to assess, what does that look like for us? And how do we make sure that we've staffed appropriately and got the right people in the right positions? So we start with discovery. And then we prioritize training and development, similar to this one, to make sure that we're all getting the same information and speaking with a common language around what this actually means and what is the strategic direction and how does everyone play a role in that and what are our expectations? But most importantly, where's the accountability? I'm gonna give you a quote from a mentor of mine. I told them I'm gonna steal it so you can quote it too. it says you get what you inspect, not what you expect. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. I can state expectations all day long, but if I'm not making sure that I follow up to ensure that those expectations are met, then we all have blind spots. We all have things that fall through the cracks. And so we got to make sure that we're inspecting all of those things that we're putting in place. Training and development allows us to ensure that we've created the kind of facilitating conditions where our leaders have everything they need, not to just achieve, but to overachieve. We got to have a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. The studies show that it takes 3 to 5 years to actually substantiate cultural change. And then we got to communicate. What are our DEI goals? Every company is different. Companies are just as diverse as the people who work in them. So we got to make sure that we have that kind of approach. You can't pick up what's happening at Starbucks and do it at Creole Cuisine and just assume that it's going to work. That's got to be based on our data and based on the people that work in this company and based on the communities that we're serving. So our DEI goals are going to look differently. They're supposed to. And then, of course, we got to implement the accountability measures, performance evaluations. What I've learned is that the only people who don't like evaluations are the people whose work don't add up. Everybody else is excited when it's come time to be evaluated. Because that means promotions. That means we getting increases, right? Because my work adds up. But the way in which we make sure that we have the conditions such that there's a systematic meritocracy is that we make sure that everyone gets an evaluation. It's got to go from employees to leadership, leadership to employees. We got to do both. Because again, we get what we inspect, not what we expect. Just because a leader comes in and says, hey, I'm knocking it out of the park. I'm a great people manager. Okay, cool. Let's go see. Let's go ask the people who actually work for you. What is that experience? Someone comes in and say, hey, I'm killing it on the floor. All right, let's go ask your supervisor. What does this look like on a day-to-day, right? So we got to make sure that we are putting these things in place. And then we got to build relationships in underrepresented communities. One of the most important parts of diversity, equity, and inclusion is relationship. It's not just about strategy. It's about relationships so that we can fully understand not only how people learn and how they grow, what makes people who they are, but how do we serve the community at large that we live in and work in? How do we make sure that what we're offering is what is going to gravitate towards people? Whether it's training and development, whether it's philanthropic work, whether it's the products and services that we're putting out, whether it's food options, no matter what it is, we got to do the work of making sure that we're tapped into relationships so that we actually meet the mark. And then lastly, and most importantly, every individual has a role to play. Me and Steve, we were walking over this morning, and I think the lady's name is Mary. And I thought he paid her. I really did. I thought it was just too perfect. We're walking over from the hotel, and Mary runs up, and she's yelling. She's excited. There's so much effort and energy, and she just ran up and gave my man a big hug. I thought it was my stepdaughter running up, and I'm like, this is work. This is amazing. When I get up and go to work every day, if I run into Mary, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a great day. It don't matter what else is going on. That kind of energy, it's our culture. It's who we are. And it's infectious. And the reason I bring that up is because every single individual sitting here today plays a critical role in how we define what this culture is. It's not just on Marv or Steve or someone else in a leadership position. Every single individual. Because whether you're interacting with staff, clients, people coming from other cities just to come and eat, have a good time. You represent this company. And every encounter sends a message to someone what the expectation is, what the experience is, and how we play a role in that. Every individual has to do their part. Contrary to popular belief, culture is not what we say it is. Culture is what people experience every day. And so one of the questions that I want to leave you with today is, what do people experience when they experience you? When I finished my basketball career, the last interview I did was with ESPN. And there was this 13-year-old boy who called into the show and he said, "Mr. Foster, I don't have a question." He said, "Man, I just want to say thank you." He said, "Thank you for being my role model." This kid didn't have a father in his life growing up, but his mom brought him to those basketball games, so he watched me. He said, "Shane, I just want to say thank you." He said, "I chose my jersey number because of you." He said, "I point up every time I make a basket because I saw you do it." He said, "My grades are great and I want to get into a school like Vanderbilt because if you can do it, then maybe I can do it too." That 13-year-old boy in that moment taught me that every single one of us has somebody that's watching us. And they may never come and pat you on the back. They may never come and tell you their story, but they're watching everything. They're watching how we interact with people. They're watching the jokes that we just walk by. Those standards being the ones that we accept. They watch who we promote and who we don't. They watch who we recommend for positions and who we don't. But they also see every single time that we show up and live out our values. They see every time we lead. We got to do our part. We have always had research and data that suggests that more diverse teams produce better outcomes. Even though in business we always hear, we just hire the best person for the job, when the best person for the job may not necessarily fit the best with the team and create the kind of synergy that produces better outcomes. The reason I show you this is because it's not just a feel-good thing to do or a moral thing to do. Diversity, equity, inclusion is also the business thing to do. But it has to be measured. And so as we do this work, we're measuring our financial performance. We're measuring our innovation. We're measuring our market share. We're measuring our talent acquisition and our ability to retain the talent that we're hiring. We're also measuring our policy enhancements and making sure that we have professional development across the board for everyone. There are all kinds of benefits to prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, not based on what the noise is saying, but making sure that every single individual is tapped in and bought in to making sure that every individual here reaches their peak performance, so that collectively we can reach our peak performance. Everything that we've talked about today falls into one of these four categories: diversity, equity, inclusion, and empathy. And so the last thing that I want to do today is give you an opportunity to reflect on your experience. And some of you, if you have, you can do this on your phone. If you brought a notepad or paper, you can write this down. But I want you to rank this company on a scale from 1 to 10 in each category. How are we doing? How are we really doing? Again, not based on the noise, but based on our integrity of our own experience. when it comes to diversity, how are we doing? How intentional have we been? When it comes to equity, am I seeing this as in practice? Not only am I getting the things that I need so that I'm growing and developing, but what about everybody else? Am I seeing those opportunities for them as well? Do I feel included? Are my experiences not only validated but welcomed? Is my opinion asked? Do I feel like I truly belong? And do we have a level of psychological safety where I'm not fearing that I'll be retaliated against by sharing my experience? Are we able to validate the experiences of others, regardless of our own personal experiences? So again, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Think about where you rank this company in all 4 categories. And I want you to talk to the person to your left or your right and share why you rank the company where you did. There is no perfect score. This is not about being good or bad. It's about stopping and reflecting on our actual experience. I'll give you 2 minutes. Go. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. I think it's important to always stop and consider, where are we? In relation to where we want to be, where are we? Do we have all that we need to accomplish the goal? And in the areas where we've fallen short, what's necessary for us to close the gap? Both collectively, but also individually. It is everyone in this room's responsibility to stop and consider, what is it that you need to be your absolute best? What is it that you're missing in your experience that would propel you from where you are today to where you could be? For those of us who are people managers, we got to constantly be asking ourselves the question, what do the people who I supervise need? And in the event that we don't have all the things that we need, when I get in my meeting with my supervisor, I got to bring that back to them. We collectively reach our peak performance level when individually we reach our peak performance levels. Again, same storm. Everyone's in a different boat. How do we make sure that every individual has what they need to be the absolute best that they can be? I'll leave you with this. My grandmother taught my mom how to bake this ham. And my mom would bake this ham all the time, and it was so good and juicy. And one day I asked my mom, why do we cut the ends off of the ham before we put it in the oven? And my mom said, well, your grandmother's the one who taught me, so let's go ask her. So I go to my grandmother, and I'm like, yo, why are we cutting the ends off of this ham before we put it in the oven? And she said, well, my mom's the one who taught me, so let's go ask her. So I go to my great-grandmother, and I'm like, listen, before you get out of here, can you please tell me why we keep cutting the ends off of this ham? And she said, son, well, back then, the oven was too small to fit it. I don't know why y'all still doing this today. How many times in business have we heard this is the way that we've always done it, when it might not be serving us well today? The answer to the questions are in this room. But we got to empower every single individual to use their experiences, use their education, use their background, but most importantly, use each other. Not to continue doing what we've always done, but to make sure that we're reaching our potential. It has been an absolute honor and a privilege to serve you all today. Thank you for having me.